One of the honorary degrees I'm proudest of was given to me by Bro Adams, so thank you very much. I can't claim to know much about war, but I'm going to talk about the stories part of the title, and about the connection between stories and identity, and on this day, I hope appropriately enough, about our American identity in particular. So on this day, when we're honoring, and I want to thank all who've been involved in organizing this event, and thank you all for coming. On a day when we're honoring those who've served this country in our armed services, I hope you'll agree that it's worth thinking a little bit about what the Americanness that binds us Americans to each other and to them actually means. And I'm a philosopher, so I want to lay out a little philosophical story that I hope you can use in giving your own answers to that important set of questions. So I want to begin with an obvious thought, which is identities come with labels, and the label American, like all labels, will need what I'm going to call application rules. We have to fix how we're going to sort people into those who do and those who don't count as Americans. Now, people can disagree, of course, about what these rules are. They do. There are probably always going to be people who think that those who differ from themselves enough are not really American. There are, I fear, some who think that you're not really American unless you speak American English properly. And since I was born in a place where we spoke a different sort of English, my own Americanness is sometimes questioned, despite the fact that I've been living and working here much longer than most of my students have been alive. But by itself, mere classification doesn't create an identity of the sort that I'm talking about, a social identity. Because you need something else, you need some other things. And one thing that makes a classification into a social identity is not just that some people are called Americans and some are denied that label, but that the way that being American figures in the thoughts and feelings and acts of people who bear the national label of Americans. So when a person identifies as an American, she will sometimes feel like or act as an American, and there are many examples of this sort of thing. You can feel proud, I can feel proud, of an American soldier or sailor or Marine who has, for example, in recent weeks, heroically aided the people of Liberia by providing medical services in the context of the Ebola epidemic. But that pride depends upon thinking of yourself as, identifying as an American. And pride of that sort, national pride, is an important force, as we all know, in modern politics. But having a national identity also means not just that you feel things, but that other people do, and so sometimes other people will treat you as an American. They'll do something to or for you, or with you, or sometimes against you, because you are an American. My favorite simple example of this is that American tourists help each other often find their way around in foreign parts. You hear an American accent, somebody sounds lost, you think, well, I'm an American, I should help them. So kindness of that sort is a perfectly common form of behavior that's directed towards fellow Americans, fellow members of the group. Unfortunately, unkindness is an equally frequent form of behavior directed against people who aren't members of the group. This is, after all, what Jim Crow was about in our own country. Separate water fountains and bathrooms, by law, meant that black and white Americans were treated differently by each other and by the government. And that was part of the significance of their distinct racial identities. The final element in my story has the fanciest name. It's norms of identification. But again, it's not a very complicated idea. Identities are useful in part because once you pin an identity on someone, you can often predict what they'll do, how they'll behave. And one reason this works is that there are associated norms, things that as Americans, people think we ought and ought not to do. Some are pretty widely agreed. We shouldn't engage in treason, for example, though we might disagree about what is treasonable. Some norms are apparently more controversial. Most of us in this room probably believe that as adult American citizens, you should vote. but only 36.5% of the voting eligible population cast ballots by the time the polls closed last Tuesday, which is, by the way, the lowest rate since World War II. So let me mention, finally, a norm that many of us recognize, especially today. We Americans ought, we think, to honor the servicemen and women and the veterans who served this country of ours because we are Americans. It's a norm of identity, a norm of American identity. Now, I've taken you through a story about what identity is in the case of our American identity, but let me underscore at once that a very wide range of kinds of people fit this general rubric, the one that I just laid out for our American identity. There are, for example, professional identities as lawyers and nurses and journalists and philosophers and soldiers. There are vocations as artists and composers and novelists. There are formal and informal affiliations as Yankee fans and jazz aficionados and Catholics and Jews. And you can undoubtedly think of more. But for all of them, you have these elements. You have the rules of application, the contested stories about who belongs, practices of identification where people do things because they belong, and treatment. People treat people because they belong to the group in certain ways, and these norms of identification, ideas about what you ought to do because you are an American, a soldier, a Jew. So identities are all over our social worlds, and we've had to learn to deal with them. And we've had the whole of human history to do that. But if we are to deal with them, we must ask what part they should play in our lives. And that's a question in ethics, by which I mean reflection on the good life, which is what Aristotle's editors meant in calling his Nicomachean Ethics that, by putting that name on it. It was reflection on the good life, because ethics is the subject that asks what it is for human lives to go well. So here's a quick sketch of what I think is our ethical situation. Each of us has a life to live. That's the fundamental fact. We face many moral problems, but they leave many moral demands, but those demands leave many options open. We mustn't be cruel, for example, but we can live in many ways without vices like that. And we also have constraints of historical circumstance and physical and mental endowment. I was born in the wrong place and time to be a samurai warrior. I have the wrong body for motherhood. I'm not musical enough to be a concert pianist. But even when you take all these things into account, each human life begins with a multitude of possibilities. Everybody should have a great variety of choices to make in shaping a life. And the ethical importance of identities like our American identity is precisely that we can take them up in this task, this fundamental human task of making the best life we can. Because the language of identity allows us to say that we make our lives as men and as women, as Americans, as Christians, as Jews or as Muslims, as philosophers, as soldiers, as lawyers, as fathers and mothers, and as daughters or sons. And identities are so diverse and extensive in the modern world because people do need an enormous array of tools in making a modern life. They're more extensive than they were in the past when people had many fewer options. Just go to the Department of Labor's list of American professions. It goes on for literally scores, hundreds of pages. There are, if you ask the Department of Labor in Elizabethan England how many jobs there were, they could have listed them on a couple of hands. So the range of options that would be sufficient for each of us wouldn't be sufficient for all of us. And people, in part because of this, people are making up new identities all the time. Gay, an identity that's much in the news these days, is basically half a century old. Goth, which is not so much in the news, is younger, but important to some people. In making an individual life, you draw on the many identities available in your society, and as we've just seen, there isn't just one way that Americans ought to behave, but there are ideas around about how we Americans ought to conduct ourselves as Americans. And these notions provide norms, models, which play a role in shaping our projects, in shaping how we make our lives. And identities also, and here we get to at least the second half of the title, identities also provide narrative forms that people can use in living their lives and telling their life stories. As the philosopher Charles Taylor has written, it's a basic condition of making sense of ourselves that we grasp our lives in a narrative. Narrative, he says, rightly, is not an optional extra. Now, our personal stories, the stories we tell of where we've been and where we're going, are made, like novels and movies and plays and folk tales, they're made within narrative conventions. Indeed, one of the things that narratives does, whether it's filmed or televised or live, whether it's performed or written, one of the things these narrative forms do for us is to provide models for telling stories about parts of our own lives. At the same time, part of the function of our collective identities, of the whole range of them that a society makes available to its members, is to structure possible stories for each individual self. So, for example, the rites of passage that societies associate with gender provide shape to the tradition to adulthood. Bar and bat mitzvahs, quinceañeras. A gay identity may organize a life around the narrative of coming out. Pentecostalists are born again. And black identities in America are often told as stories of self-discovery and construction in the face of racism and racial disadvantage. And one thing that matters to people across many societies is a certain narrative wholeness, the ability to tell a story of your life that coheres. The story, my story, should hang together in the way appropriate to a person in my society. And one kind of coherence has to do with how my story fits into the wider story of various groups. My family, my faith, and of course, my country. Ethnic and national identities fit this, your personal narrative, into a larger, bigger story, a bigger picture. Americans live lives embedded in an American set of stories, but also in an overarching American story. My life is an immigrant life, but it's part of a long story of American immigration. And this narrative element isn't simply a feature of Western modernity. Around the world, it matters to people. It has always mattered to people that they can tell a story of their lives that meshes with larger narratives. And that's one reason why literature, including the sort of drama we're about to witness, is so important to all of us. It's one source of the narrative forms that allow us to tell our own lives. Now, narrative was central to earlier forms of political identity too, of course, the Homeric poems, which have already been mentioned, Greek tragedies, like the one we'll see soon. These were important for the citizens of ancient Athens. The Augustan poetry of Virgil was important for a cultivated Roman elite. The oral epic of Sundiata is important for Malinke societies in West Africa. The chronicles of Shaka are important for Zulu identity. If there's something distinctive that the new national stories have, I think it's this, that they bind us together not in a shared subordination to gods and kings and heroes, but as fellow participants, equals, in a shared story. America's story is one Americans make together. It's a democratic story in that sense. And we Americans are bound together today through narratives in which our country does things. And what binds each of us to the community, and thus to each other, is in part our participation through our national identity in those things America does. Among the things America has done in this sense is beat the Nazis through the sacrifices of the Second World War, free the slaves through the sacrifices of the Civil War, grant women the suffrage in 1920 after much struggle on behalf of that end, and lose the war in Vietnam. Now, these stories, like all the other elements of identity, are going to be contested. Maybe some people in this room don't think we did lose the war in Vietnam, and show this fact of contest, shows that we should remember that our identities can divide as well as unite us. Not only can we disagree about the norms of American identity, as we saw, we can also find our nation both divided and united through other identities, racial identities, as I've already mentioned, gender and religion, for example. Many people in the United States voted for President Obama because they wanted an African American in the White House. Fewer people voted against him because they didn't. But for some black Americans, it mattered in a special way that there was finally someone in the White House who shared their identity. Now, most of those who voted for him did so because they also thought he would pursue policies they favored. They didn't vote for him just because they shared an identity. But even for those people, the fact that there was a black man now in the White House was a source of good feeling and a kind of racial pride. Just as many Americans, black and white and yellow and brown, felt a certain pride in the fact that our country had escaped from its long legacy of racism and finally elected a black man. And so their pride was not racial, but national. Now, the idea that people can, indeed that they should, identify as American and do, think, and feel things as a result will have seemed natural to you, I am sure. Indeed, you may have wondered why I bothered to remind you of it. But that intimate engagement with our nationality, with our Americanness in this case, that sense that your nationality is an important part of who you are, is a crucial part of modern life, because in that sense, we are all nationalists nowadays, all around the world. And yet, of course, this was not always so. And in fact, it requires a spectacular feat of imagination to step outside the framework of modern nationalism. Almost everyone everywhere today on the planet lives with a picture of the world which is as natural as it could possibly be, that the world is divided into a couple of hundred nation states, whose members, if they are lucky, are patriotic citizens of a country they love. But that idea only took form slowly, and it only took form relatively recently. It began in Europe, I suppose, after the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, which essentially turned the old Holy Roman Empire into a collection of mostly German-speaking states, each with its own sovereignty. And in so doing, it set in motion a significant shift in the heart of Europe. These newly independent states inherited the principles of religious freedom established in the Reformation by the so-called Augsburg Confession, which granted each ruler the right to determine his own sovereign religious affiliation. In the first instance, religious freedom was for sovereigns, not for all of us. And so political theorists speak of a Westphalian model, where each nation-state has its own sovereignty, subject to no higher secular or religious authority, independent both of the empire and of Rome. But in 1648, at the time of the Treaty of Westphalia, or the two treaties of Westphalia, since the Catholics and the Protestants refused to meet together, so they had to meet in two different places to sign two different copies. In 1648, this was, globally speaking, a very unusual idea. To the east, after all, was the Ottoman Empire, whose units were not nations, but a variety of peoples, speaking many languages, living often in multilingual cities, where each religious or ethnic group governed itself by its own rules under the overall surveillance of an Ottoman sultan who lived in what Europeans at that point called Constantinople. Further east, again in South Asia, in 1648, Shah Jahan was ruling a Mughal Empire that was composed again of many religions and peoples. And in China, the Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty had ended the Ming dynasty only 4 years earlier in 1644, taking over a vast territory that, like the Ottoman and the Mughal empires, was, once more, remarkably internally diverse in language, religion, cuisine, and the practices of everyday life. In Africa, to Europe's south, the Ottomans ruled much of the northern coastline, but to their south and east, the Emperor Fasciladas had recently expelled the Jesuits from Ethiopia. The Jesuits had already gotten settled and kicked out of Ethiopia by the time of the Treaty of Westphalia. And he, the Emperor Fasciladas, had consolidated his hold on an empire that had persisted in various forms since the 1st century BCE. In the west of Africa, the empire of Songhai lay in ruins, destroyed by revolts, first by the Hausas to their south, and then by the Moroccan Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur. In southern Africa, Meni Mutapa had fallen to the Portuguese a generation earlier. All this is happening in the year of the Treaty of Westphalia. And in the Congo kingdom, the Catholic monarch Garcia Nkanga Lukeni, Garcia II as he was known, was struggling with secession in Soyo and dealing, as Congo kings had had to do for more than a century, with the Portuguese and the Dutch. But in Africa too, large numbers of people lived all over the continent, as elsewhere all around the world, outside even the nominal control of any state. Farming, hunting, gathering vegetables and honey, nuts, and regulating their life through local forms of politics that looked nothing like a nation state. Except in the stories of those free peasants and hunter-gatherers, the names of kingdoms and empires play a large role because kings and emperors resonate largely in the archives from which we reconstruct the human past. Whether we're speaking of the written archives of literate bureaucracies, Ethiopia, Songhai, the Holy Roman Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Qing dynasty, or of the oral traditions of empires ruled without writing, like Manu Mutapa in South Africa, our evidence is shaped by the politics of its creation and transmission. It's simply harder to tell the lives of the 17th century Africans or Asians who lived outside the empires. Their descendants may know their lineages and some of their travels and traditions, but without other sources, we're unlikely to be able to tell exactly what the ancestors of the San Bushmen of the Kalahari were doing in 1648. The very idea of a universal dating system, the idea that you might wonder what people in 5 continents, thousands of miles apart, were doing on the day that the Treaty of Westphalia was signed, that would have struck those Bushman ancestors as, at best, bizarre. What would be the point of that way of thinking about things? Those Manchu, if you could explain to them who the Manchu were, those Manchu, they could plausibly have said, and they would have been joined in chorus by most people in the 17th century in most places outside China, those Manchu have nothing to do with us. Nevertheless, these stories confirm that there have been names of peoples, Roman, Mughal, Manchu, since before the modern idea of the nation-state. And behind that idea, that modern idea, the anthropologist Arjun Appiah has insisted, is the idea of a national, what he calls a national ethnos. And that is new. No modern nation, he says, however benign its political system and however eloquent its public voices may be about the virtues of tolerance, multiculturalism, and inclusion, is free of the idea that its national sovereignty is built on some sort of, again, his phrase, ethnic genius. Now, that thought is one that was first philosophically developed in the late European Enlightenment, in particular in the writings of Johann Gottfried Herder. Herder forged both the idea of the nation and the idea that the natural political expression of nationality was what we now call the nation-state. What Appiah calls the ethnic genius of the nation, Herder called its Volksgeist, the spirit of its people. And Herder taught that every member of a people shared that spirit with every other member. That spirit found its expression above all in language and the literature of the folk, poetry and song, tales and myths, as well as in the music, art, and literature produced both by the common people and by its leading creative spirits, its geniuses. It was in the name of recording that national spirit of the German people that the Brothers Grimm set out to collect those German fairy tales that we now all know. They were collected in the course of a nationalist enterprise, the nationalist enterprise of understanding the German Geist. And it was with the same aim of recording, preserving and purifying the spirit of the German language, their so-called Sprachgeist, that they began the great German dictionary, the Deutsche Wörterbuch. It was in the same spirit that scholars began the collection of folk music from Bavaria to Saxony, and that they celebrated the poetry of Goethe and Hölderlin. A people's folklore, the wisdom of the folk, defines the common spiritual or intellectual life of a nation in this view. And a nation with its shared spiritual life is the natural unit of government. Now, it's that picture, I think, that it takes a great leap of imagination to escape. And the fact that it is hard to escape should be puzzling. Literature and music and movies and theater and sport are, after all, quite transnational in their influences and their effects. Our drama is affected by the drama of the Greeks and the French and the Romans. And increasingly, I saw a play downtown the other day which used themes and traditions from Southern African song to tell a story. And in fact, hardly any nation fits the picture of the homogeneous monocultural state living under a single government. There aren't any Herderian nations. And to the extent that there are, it's the result of violent conflict, civil wars, ethnic expulsions, and so on. Eugen Weber, for example, taught a generation of students of French history that as late as 1893, a quarter of the 30 million citizens of metropolitan France had not mastered French. A quarter of them in 1893. And as Linda Colley argued in her marvelous book, Britain's Forging the Nation, and she means forging in every sense of that word, the sense of a common identity here in Britain did not come into being because of an integration and homogenization of disparate cultures. Instead, Britishness was superimposed over an array of internal differences in response to contact with the other. And since this is Britain, the other here is France. What makes France French or Britain British? It doesn't matter what you say, language, laws, cuisine, the empire, Protestantism, the laicité of the Republic. None of these is ever a good answer. And I need hardly point out that if the states of Western Europe who invented this Herderian ideology don't fit the mold, then it's rare to find anything like it anywhere else. India, China, Nigeria, each of them has hundreds of languages and ethnic groups. Here at home, in these United States, where most people speak some sort of English, we don't really have, despite what people say in American studies, a single national culture. Everything that's normally said to be American, from hamburgers to Hollywood to consumer capitalism, is found elsewhere and is, in any case, not much appreciated by lots of Americans. Ask the Amish about hamburgers and Hollywood and consumer capitalism. There are, I suppose, candidates for Herderian states. I'll give you one, Japan, where 99% of the population identifies as Japanese, though I should point out that their script is Chinese, their largest religion is Indian, and there are 15 Japanese languages listed on ethnologue.com. So by and large, people don't live in monocultural, monoreligious, monolingual nation states, and by and large, they never have. So the lesson, I think, is that nationality, including our American nationality, for better or worse, has become an increasingly central feature of the identities of modern men and women, but that the content of this nationality, its meaning for each of us, is the result of cultural work, the sort of work actually sponsored by the National Endowment. It's not the result of a natural and pre-existing commonality, an Americanness that's just sitting there waiting to be mined. And that means there is a place for reflection in it, for working out together in the democratic spirit what it means to be American. And since the nation is constructed not only by its narratives of the past, but also by its shared projects, the real place of the nation is not in the past, not even in the present, but it's in a future that we American citizens will have to try to construct together. Thank you.